Here we have a small component which is meant to resemble a so-called panel. So as you can see, we have a panel heading, we have a panel title, and we have a panel body. And what we would like to do now here is to give this some more styling that it looks a bit nicer. So the first approach is usually to go to the index.html file and add a style tag here. Inside that style tag, we can then add our classes, such as panel, and add some styles that make our panel look a bit cooler. Rather than writing out the whole styles, I'm simply pasting in some of them here. And as you can see, we get already some nicer looking panel. While this perfectly works, in a more component-oriented design, we would like to have our styling that is specific to our component be directly bound to this component. Just as we have our HTML part here and our JavaScript part here, we would also like to have our styling part here. So let's go back to our index.html file here and remove our styles which we have added previously. And go inside our component. And in Angular, we can use our styles property for this. The styles property takes an array, and inside there we can use the backticks, which allow us to have some multi-line strings, and we paste in our CSS code here. Let's save it again, and you can see how the styles get applied again to our component. Now, as you can see, there is quite some CSS code inside here, which starts to make our component file look a bit messy. So with a couple of lines, this works perfectly fine, but in this case, I would rather go and split that out into a separate file. So instead of using the styles property, we can use the style URLs property, which also takes an array. But now we add the path to our styles file inside here. So let's call that styled.component.css. And we obviously have to create that file also. And let's paste in our CSS code inside there. Let's again save it. And once the browser refreshes, you can see how the styles get applied again. We can use the style property to add, for instance, some background color to our div here. Let's add some yellow. Great. Then let's cut this out for a second and create here a get background color function. And we obviously also have to declare it here on our class. And as a first step, let's simply return our yellow string again. Then let's create some variable, some show style toggle, and set it to false. And in our get background color function, we can then say something like if this dot show style, then let's return our yellow string. And otherwise we return simply an empty string. To see this in action, we can simply add here a click listener and we toggle our show style variable. By then clicking on the div, we can toggle our style. Now obviously this works for any kind of style. For instance, let's change the color of our font. Let's set it to red. And you can see how this gets applied. In this example, we have a component with a div inside here. We apply here a rounded border CSS class, which we define here in the styles property. Now, very often in real-world applications, you have the need to add those classes conditionally based on some application state. In Angular, we can do that by wrapping the whole part here in square brackets. Then we add a point here, and we basically translate our CSS class like this. Then we make the equal sign, and we add the condition. Let's add true. If we save, you can see the border still gets applied. If we switch it to false, it doesn't get applied anymore. Obviously, you can also bind this to some variable which is defined in your JavaScript part of your component. Let's set it to false to demonstrate this. If we set it to true, it gets activated again. To make this even a bit more dynamic, we could use here a p tag, and let's add a checkbox. So let's wrap it in a label. We need an input type of type checkbox. Add border. Add a label here. And now we basically establish a two-way binding with our isBorder variable. And now if we toggle this, the border gets toggled and we can switch it back on and off. So here we have a very simple component with some predefined styles. Now if you have the need to add multiple CSS classes to a DOM element within our component, for instance this div here, we can use the ngClass. And let's use here a ngClasses variable, which we define directly inside our component here. And this variable is directly bound to that ngClass definition up here. What we can do now is to directly here specify the name of the CSS class, and you can see how it gets applied to our DOM element. We can also directly add a space here and add further classes, and as you can see all of them get applied. Another possibility is to use an array. So we could wrap this in an array here. And as you can see, it still works. You can also remove one and it works again. Obviously, these can be added dynamically within your application code. So you can add or remove classes here from that array. A third possibility which we have is to use an object. Now, the main advantage of using an object is that we get another value here. So being a key value kind of data structure, we can add here Boolean conditions. Let's wrap this a bit nicer here so that we get a better sight of the variables. So we add here a Boolean condition. Let's add false for the highlight. And let's add true for the strike. And as you can see, based on the outcome of these values, the classes get applied or not. So these are all CSS classes. So as such, they belong more to the HTML part up here rather than to the JavaScript part. So most often you see them directly inline. So let's reformat them again. And now let's cut them out. Let's remove that CSS part here and go to our ngClass definition again, and we paste it in again. Let's save, and it still works. Now as a next step, you usually bind those variables here, which obviously are not hard-coded, but they are directly bound to some variables which are defined inside here, so in your JavaScript part. So let's add here is bold. Great. And obviously we need to bind them. Is bold, is highlight, and is strike. And to get a better effect here, let's add some checkboxes. Great. So as you can see, the checkboxes are two-way data bound to our variables, which we have defined here below. And in turn, those variables are data bound via that ngClass directive here. And now we can then activate or deactivate different kind of styles and even multiple styles. Often when we want to style our HTML elements within our components, rather than adding CSS classes, we want to apply our styles directly. Now, since this is valid HTML, we can definitely do that. For instance, let's add some border around our div here. So as you can see, this perfectly works. However, if we want to make this a bit more dynamic, what we can do instead is to use the ngstyle directive. Here we can reference an object. Let's call it, for instance, border style, which is a property which we have to define in our component class. Inside that border style again, we can then define our properties, like 1 pixel solid black for the border. Let's add some border radius of, let's say, 3 pixels. Let's also add some width of 200 pixels and some padding. So if you save this, you can see how it gets applied, because this object inside here gets bound to that ngstyle, which then, if we inspect the HTML code here, directly applies those styles as a style property on the div element. So far this is pretty simple, but obviously we want to add some more dynamic behavior. For instance, add some width which is steered by some user input. So to do that, let's add here a p, and let's add here some input field of type text, and a button that allows us to set that. Inside that input field, let's give it a name. Let's call it box width. And now whenever we click on that button, we want to invoke a method that says update style. And we use that box width dot value, which we pass into that method. Obviously, we have to define that method in our component, and it takes the width as a parameter. And now inside here, we simply reference that border style. We use that width, and then we basically associate the width which we get from the input field. Now, obviously, we have to concatenate this because here we get a strings value, and we need to add that pixels as a suffix, which is the unit. So we can here use the syntax and then concatenate both values. Now, when we add here 100 and say set, we can see how the box nicely reshapes. Now, obviously, concatenating these values down here is not really nice. So what the ngstyle allows us to do is to specify the kind of unit which we want to use directly after the property by using the dots notation. And so in this case, we can simply drop the pixels suffix here and use a number, which is much more convenient. Obviously, we have to use the quotes here because, again, this wouldn't be a valid JavaScript property. And also here, we have to use the bracket notation for accessing that value. But now we can change this one here because it is now a number that gets passed to the border style. And again, if we add here 100, it nicely reshapes. So here we have a neat little box, and what we would like to do is to show our gravatar image inside that box. Now, obviously, there are different kind of possibilities to do so. But for the purpose of this example, we want to dynamically compute our style element here and use a background image. So for that purpose, we create here a getStyle function. And inside here, we simply, for the first step, copy in that style and return that. Then let's create here our gravatar URL, which in a real world example, we would probably fetch from some profile of the user. And then we can use the background image, and we use URL property. And here we would like to fill in the gravatar URL. So let's change these to backticks, which allows us to use the syntax here, gravatar URL. Okay, so let's save this. Now we want to bind this to the style property here on our element, which we do like this. And then obviously invoke our getStyle function. But apparently this doesn't work. So let's open the console here. And what you can see here is a warning message from Angular, which says that there's a sanitizing process that has to be done for basically marking these unsafe values background image as safe. And it also links here to a URL where you can look up. This is basically the docs of Angular. This is because linking here a background image URL inside the style sheet and dynamically binding that to the DOM elements is a potential XSS bug, so a cross-site scripting bug. And for that purpose, Angular defines different kind of security contexts. And in order to mark those properties as safe explicitly, what we need to do is to import the sanitizer, which comes from the Angular platform browser. This is the so-called DOM sanitizer. And here, rather than returning the style string directly, we have to get the instance of a sanitizer, which we can get injected in the constructor. And now down here, we can say this.sanitizer. And then we have different kind of methods here. So one is for the trusted HTML, One is for resource URLs, one for scripts, for styles, and for trusted URLs here. So these are basically the security contexts Angular defines. In our case, we are applying a dynamic style, so we use the trust style. And we pass in here the style property. Now we have to return this sanitized style and save again. And now you can see the image gets displayed correctly and there's no more warning anymore in the console. So if you take a look at the method name, it says explicitly bypass security trust style. And also the information shown here in the documentation says, warning, calling this method with untrusted user data exposes your application to XSS security risks. So you obviously have to apply this only if you're sure what you're doing is trustful. Usually when we want to style our component, what we have to do is to define within our styles property the according CSS class, which we can then apply to some element within our component. However, if we take a look, what happens here is obviously that the style gets applied to the div that resides within our component tag. So you can see here that host styling tag, which represents our component. For some scenarios, however, what we really want is that the class gets applied directly to that host styling tag of our component rather than to some inner kind of element. So a first approach would be to simply go to the point where we define our component here and to add there that yellow style class. Let's save this. Let's also remove that class from the inner HTML element. But what you can see here is that the actual style doesn't get applied to our div. So while the class is obviously there is no kind of style injected. And the problem here is that this style is directly scoped to that component, so it doesn't leak outside. For this purpose, we can use a special meta tag called host and wrap our style with that kind of meta tag. With this tag, we can define that our style, so the yellow style class here, should be applied to the host of our component, so that host styling tag. So if we save again, we can see how the style gets applied, and in fact the class obviously is still there. You now note that special tag that has been dynamically applied by Angular, which is then used for scoping our style. Now this was actually quite a simple example, as we applied the style statically directly on our host element. Most often, however, we want to control from the inside of our component whether that style gets applied to that host element or not. For doing so, we can import the host binding, always from the Angular core. And this now gives us the possibility to specify a host binding to the class element and in specific to our yellow style. And you can already see that here we can basically specify a variable that indicates whether that style should be applied or not. We can now simply add here a button with a click listener, which simply toggles our yellow style. And now as you can see, we can switch the style on and off, and you can also see how it gets added or removed on our host element. Assume we have this simple component here, and what we want is to apply some styling to our component, but to the actual host context styling, so to the host tag of our component, but only if some of its ancestors has a specific styling tag. So basically, if our component here is wrapped in a div with styled component, with the class that is named styled component, then we want to have a border on our host context styling tag. So we can go inside our component again, and here we can use the style property and define that styled component style. And we simply do something like 1 pixel, solid black, and display block to see some styling. Now this isn't enough, because this style would only be valid within this component here, and it wouldn't be applied depending on some ancestor styled class here, for instance, that styled component class. So what we can do instead here is to use the host context meta tag and wrap our style in that tag. And now if we save again, we can see how the style gets correctly applied to our component. In the very same manner, we may want to style some of our child components rather than our ancestors. So for instance, take this simple child component here, which has a simple p tag inside there. If we now instantiate that child component within our host context component, we see that the component gets rendered properly. And now one could go here and say we want to style all p tags with a background color of yellow. Now again, as you can see, strange enough, this doesn't get applied to our child component. And the reason is that this style here gets scoped only to this component here. So obviously in Angular there is a solution for applying such styles. What we can do here is to use the host selector, and then we can use the so-called deep selector, which is also often called the shadow piercing the Shannon combinator. And what this special syntax here allows us is basically to escape the scoping of our component here and dive into the child component here and style tags inside there. So if we save this, we can see that the style gets properly applied now. Now there's a problem associated with this deep selector. It was initially introduced by the Blink team, but meanwhile it has been deprecated by the W3C and there is no standard so far. Now in order to avoid problems with other tools such as SAS and so on, which are going to deprecate that feature in there as well, the Angular team has introduced the so-called ngdeep tag starting from Angular version 4.3.1. As you can see here as well, the style gets correctly applied. So as a general rule of thumb, you should basically try to avoid such deep selectors whenever you can. If you really have to use them, start to use the ngdeep selector until there is some official standard coming out. Here we have a very simple directive, which when applied onto an element, we would like to style that element with some properties. So as a first step, we simply go onto our HTML part here and we add that styled tag. With this, we basically apply our directive onto that div here. As a next step within that directive, we need to get hold of this div here in order that we can add some styles. We can do that as a first step by importing the element ref, always from Angular core. And then in the constructor, we can get that element ref injected. As a next step, that element ref has an API, which allows us to access the native element, which is actually the underlying DOM element. And so from here on, we can use the native HTML API, so style.background color equals yellow. And if we save this, we see how the style gets applied to our element. So as you can see, this works perfectly. However, it should be avoided to directly access the native element here, because Angular is designed to run also in environments where we actually don't have a DOM API, for instance on the server side or when rendered within a web worker. So let's comment that part out for a second. And instead we can use a more abstract object, which is called a renderer2, which again import, and then we get it injected here. And the renderer allows us to have a more abstract API. So we can do something like set style. We pass in the element, which we get from the element ref.native element. Then we define the style, which in our case is the background color, and we give it a value, which is yellow. We again save, and we can see how that style gets applied again. This makes our code much more safe for non-DOM API environments, because the renderer and the set style method basically abstracts the environment from the actual logic we want to apply.